So this one's going to be a little bit different. I have no slides prepared per se, but I'm just going to be talking to the camera about dopamine. So feel free to just listen to this if you're going for a walk or whatever, or if you want to see me just talking and sweating bullets, then you can do that as well. But yeah, this is going to be a webinar on dopamine, um, and basically just covering absolutely everything tied to dopamine. Um, it goes far beyond. I mean, just the general definition of dopamine is very much tied to the reward and pleasure pathways of the brain, as we know, as a lot of people know. Um, and it's a main target of the modern world is to have this low dopamine state because then you become less stimulated by the natural dopamine pulses. So, for example, like sunlight or sex or laughter or whatever it may be, and then you become a slave to technology, porn, processed foods, um, and even pharmaceuticals to a degree, various ones that target certain things, the brain, and quite an obvious one for that is ADD and ADHD, which utilizes things such as Ritalin, which is basically it's literally amphetamine, the way it behaves in the brain. And in my opinion, I think ADD and ADHD is just a personality type at the most. But I mean, I would say that I have somewhat ADD, ADHD-like tendencies, but it's just all about being able to harness it to your advantage. It can be a superpower per se, um, just because of the way your brain works. You can literally just constantly come up with thoughts and ideas. You just got to funnel it into the beneficial stuff. But again, these people are more like myself, and I was very susceptible to having low dopamine. I become one of the main targets of it per se, just because of that personality type, I suppose, and the neurochemistry behind it. Um, so yeah, mo dopamine is tied to that motivation, pleasure, drive pathway, but tying it in with the ADD, it is so that's more around in the midbrain and the substantia nigra is what's going on with that dopamine there regarding rewards, but in it's also in the prefrontal cortex. It plays a big role in terms of working memory, um, decision making, judgment, and then of course attention is a big one there that we just mentioned there regarding the ADD. Neurochemistry. But even beyond that, so just quickly on the decision making and judgment and stuff as well. Again, that's a great target. If you have low dopamine, you can't think clearly, you can't make good decisions. It's even tied to awareness as well. So all these things just make you somewhat controllable in the modern world. Also, the fact that you actually like dopamine is literally the antidote to suppressing any sort of fear. And that's tied to its interactions with in the amygdala, which is an emotional processing fear-related brain region that requires not only dopamine but a few others. But dopamine's playing a big role there in uh, if we do have a fear that pops up in our brain, to be able to just shut that down and distinguish it as just like a thought, as opposed to something that you predominantly act on per se and create a sympathetic response to. And beyond this, it's tied to various hormones, which we're going to get into, but testosterone's a big one there, and DHT helps with the release of that through controlling prolactin in the pituitary gland, um, which is pretty key. So again, that's another. If you just follow the pattern there for this is just men at the moment regarding this stuff, but that's another big factor is low testosterone, low dopamine, and the prolactin cycle is never really shutting off. Even issues with thyroid start to kick in with that pathway too. Um, and again, we got to remember that melanin can be broken down into dopamine too. So yeah, it's just all these various steps that start to hopefully start to make sense as you further listen to this and what is going on with dopamine. And when I talk about dopamine, I'm gonna also tie in that it's tyrosine derived metabolite, so thyroid hormone, melanin, noradrenaline, and adrenaline, because they're all somewhat interchangeable in a way, to a degree. depending on what is going on with your light environment and oxygen tensions. I will get into that, but just remember that this, like the melanin, low melanin will lead to low dopamine as well, and vice versa. Um, so yeah, back to hormones. That's huge there in terms of controlling um LH and FSH, which go down, luteinizer hormone and follicular stimulating hormone, which go down into the testicles. And this is for females too, to a degree, but obviously not your testicles. And it just helps with hormone cycles, basically. And then that, as a man, for testosterone, that goes back up into the brain and influences dopamine activity. So it's a positive feedback loop, basically. Not only that, so it's tied to erections as well, and driving erections and libido. Um, Both directly tied to it, but also indirectly through what I just said before regarding hormones and testosterone and things of that nature. It's also found in the eye in high amounts, and it works in balance with melatonin to control photoreceptors and opsin proteins to help regenerate them, basically, and control the action potentials from our retina through to our visual cortex and through to our hypothalamus, through something called controlling gap junctions. And that gap junction is called CX36. And dopamine plays a big role in terms of controlling that. So you find that people with low dopamine may have low or issues with their vision, issues with their eyes, light sensitivity, things of that nature as well. And in terms of habit formation, that's a big one too. So with habit formation, that's tied to the basal ganglia, which is a region of your brain in the forebrain. And it's not only tied to rewards, but also forming habits. It's also tied to motor movement as well. So obviously things like Parkinson's that we're aware of, that is degradation of dopaminergic neurons, predominantly in the substantia nigra, but that's also influencing what's going on in terms of the activity in the basal ganglia. But again, habit formation, that's a big one as well. So the ability to adapt and form new healthy habits requires dopamine. Again, focus and attention, spoke about that, but that works hand in hand with acetylcholine. So that's why people who have nicotine addictions, per se, from vaping or smoking cigarettes or whatever it may be, downstream of that, because nicotine acts on acetylcholine's cholinergic nicotinic receptors, that downstream influences dopamine. So you know straight away when someone is constantly vaping or smoking cigarettes, they have an acetylcholine and dopamine problem. And it's generally tied to you'll find that they will have other habits that they can't seem to break off because it does send you down this downward spiral. So other things like some dead giveaways would be porn, would be scrolling on TikTok uncontrollably, always checking your phone first thing in the morning, and just lacking the motivation and drive to do anything to change, basically. Um, so that's huge so far. And that's just talking about what's going on in the brain. But there's a lot of things going on in our peripheral body regarding dopamine too. So one of them is the fact that it can control electrolyte status in the kidneys. It can control what electrolytes get excreted and what stay. And that obviously there's other hormones like aldosterone playing a big role there, but it also has an influence. Gut motility. So it plays a role alongside serotonin, and of course there's other neurotransmitters that are influencing it, but it actually plays a role in controlling gut motility. And there's actually 5 different dopamine receptors, so it can have an influence, an on and an off switch. It's not just completely excitatory or completely inhibitory, which is also pretty interesting. It plays a role in modulating the immune system. It controls or has a relationship with insulin and leptin. So if you have low dopamine, you're not going to be able to release insulin properly, and you're not going to be able to release leptin properly, or just control it at the right times. And we have to remember as well that there's actually, like, if you think of the fuel gauge for leptin as like appetite, but then dopamine is like the fuel gauge for reward and pleasure. So you need both of those filled for leptin signaling to work properly. And if it's not satisfied, then you're going to just keep eating regardless of if you're full or not, because you're trying to fill that dopaminergic that empty dopaminergic void, basically. It plays a role in thermogenesis, uh, along with other catecholamines in terms of heat production and things of that nature. And another interesting one is that it controls histamine and melatonin. So it will play a role in shutting off melatonin production first thing in the morning via the D2 dopamine receptor. But whilst it does that, it also disinhibits histamine. So having dopamine there is required to literally make you feel alert in the morning beyond just the cortisol spike that we're meant to get from circadian influence. It plays a role in REM sleep, in initiating REM sleep. So the first step to actually starting the sleep cycle of REM requires a release of dopamine, and that will influence other neurotransmitters downstream. But if you have a lack of dopamine, you may not have optimal REM sleep, and you may not have optimal dreaming, which is a key giveaway there. Time perception as well. So if you have low or too high dopamine, time goes, you perceive time differently, basically. And that's why when we're out and we have natural stimulation of dopamine, time, it's quantized. The cutoff of dopamine is quantized to nature. So you will never get too high or never get too low. Which I think is just amazing that we have these programmed within us that you'll get enough so you dopamine that you'll feel good, but it will cut it off before it comes harmful, basically. Um, but yeah, you notice that. I mean, if you've ever had a night out or whatever, and if you've gotten on the on the drugs and alcohol, you may notice that your night goes by literally like that, click of a finger. Um, People with low dopamine as well, it's just people always say that the years are just going faster and faster, but I just think people are just losing more dopamine. Um, Also, in the peripheral system, it controls the muscle fiber type, so it can determine whether we have fast twitch or slow twitch forms of muscles, and what is downstream of that in terms of the mitochondrial density or the enzymes that are required. So it helps you adapt to your environment, and that's tied into athletic performance and things of that nature. And that's why melanin is important there because melanin can be built up in various tissues, especially ones like away from the brain where they're more oxygen derived, but they require a bunch of oxygen, is that the melanin is playing a big role there to liberate oxygen from water, but also breaks down into dopamine to aid in this mechanism. And a big one is for that is your CARs, your gastrocnemius is a huge muscle and requires a lot of energy input. It's obviously tied to your Achilles tendon as well. Collagen's playing a big role there, so optimizing collagen. But that melanin is there's a lot of POMC there, and that's going to form melanin ideally. And then again, that melanin can break down to dopamine and control that muscle fiber type. But then also on the neuronal level of dopamine playing a role in motor movement as well is a big player there. Especially when we need lots of it. So yeah, that's and I think there's honestly more. I just wrote this quick little list off the top of my head, but I know that there's definitely more in terms of what dopamine can do. Um, and yeah, I mean, I believe dopamine, melatonin, melanin, and vitamin D are the four key molecules in the body that are getting attacked at from every angle to be low. And they're all derived from sunlight, funnily enough. We need UV light for them, and we need infrared light for some of them as well. So how do we make dopamine? Well, I kind of just gave it away there, but let's talk about the ingredients that we require. So tyrosine is the precursor. It's an amino acid. It's found in some foods, but also we got phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is also an amino acid. And this is also found in foods. And what happens is the phenylalanine will convert into tyrosine by an enzyme called phenylalanine hydroxylase. That requires UV light, and it also requires BH4. It also requires iron and vitamin C. And that tyrosine then forms L-DOPA. through tyrosine hydroxylase, and that actually is the exact same cofactors. So we need oxygen tensions high for that to work, and we need sunlight. We need that injection of UV light to make this work because tyrosine and phenylalanine are both aromatic amino acids. And what that basically means is their structure, they have a benzene ring. And if you look at it, it kind of looks like what DHA looks like, but just one ring of it. And what it actually is, it creates a pi electron cloud. And that means the electrons in that ring are delocalized. And we've got to remember that the photoelectric effect states that the photons only interact with electrons, and the photons from sun, the UV light from the sun, will interact with these electrons in a more effective fashion because of this delocalized effect of the benzene ring. Tyrosine and phenylalanine absorb UV light. They absorb UVA, UVB, and strongly in UVC. And we make our own UVC light through various mechanisms. I'm not going to get into that this webinar, but it's tied to deuterium, it's tied to red blood cells, it's tied to melanin, literally transducing light via something called non-linear optics to literally increase the wavelength of light. And it's a quantum mechanism. And yeah, it's pretty cool how it all works. And that UVC light interacts with various molecules. You'll find that a lot of molecules in the body absorb strongly at UVC light. And that UVC light doesn't penetrate the atmosphere. So we literally make it internally in quantized, polarized amounts. So it's more concentrated and it acts like a laser and it can directly interact with those amino acids. But again, these amino acids are also absorbed just by sunlight as well in the UVA and UVB spectrum. And that photoactivates them. It can either photoactivate them directly, so then they can get excited energetically and get transformed and enzymatically activated to their downstream products, or it can be absorbed and then funneled down into the hydration shell of that amino acid and sent through the system to let the system know, okay, there's UV light around. Let's convert this energy that we have into the dopamine and the catecholamines in general. So anyway, we're at L-DOPA. This L-DOPA can actually form melanin as well, beyond dopamine. So but it goes through a different enzyme, and that enzyme's called tyrosinase. And that requires copper, and that requires vitamin C and zinc. And that's obviously done in our melanocytes for the most part, and POMC neurons through the activation of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, this is all important because that melanin can break down to dopamine. Under certain conditions when sunlight's missing. So it acts as like a reservoir. But again, once you're in sunlight, you're building up all of these at the same time, which is great. It builds up that resilience per se. I also just wanted to add that once tyrosine converts into L-DOPA, L-DOPA then forms dopamine. And that requires an enzyme called amino acid decarboxylase, or tyrosine decarboxylase in this case. DOPA decarboxylase. And this DOPA decarboxylase requires P5P, which is vitamin B6, as a cofactor, because any sort of decarboxylase enzyme requires P5P in it, vitamin B6 in its active form. And this P5P gets activated by copper, it gets activated by B1 and zinc. They're all involved in the activation, as well as oxygen is required for P5P oxidase, which is fundamental for the last step in activating this vitamin B6 form. And then it goes on to produce dopamine and so on. Now, once we've got dopamine, this dopamine can either be stored in a vesicle in a neuron, which is literally like a storage facility, and that requires ATP, so optimal mitochondrial function, and that dopamine will stay in the vesicle. And when it stays in the vesicle, it can be released at a later date. And this is exactly the mechanism that amphetamines work on. Amphetamines aid in the release of dopamine from these vesicles through something called the vesicle is called the actual transport is called VMAT2, and amphetamine acts on that to release dopamine. And then that dopamine obviously goes and binds to the receptors and things of that nature. And there is, as I said before, 5 dopamine receptors. D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5. D1 and D5 are excitatory, so they make things happen. D2, D3, D4 have a bit more complexity. They are inhibitory, but they can act through various mechanisms to inhibit neurons that actually inhibit. So it can act as like a fine tuner of circuits in the brain. So for an example, if there was a D2 receptor and dopamine acts on it, and that D2 receptor is on a GABA neuron, and that GABA neuron is inhibiting another circuit, that dopamine is literally, it's called disinhibiting. So it will inhibit the GABA neuron, but then that GABA is meant to inhibit the neural circuit downstream, but it won't. So hence it's somewhat activating it in a secondhand fashion. But this D2 receptor can also control dopamine, so it doesn't get to too high amounts, and that's what happens when we are under the correct like stimulus of dopamine. So, for example, sunlight's a big one. Sunlight will increase dopamine D2 receptors to a degree, whilst we also make dopamine on top of that from sunlight, and it will increase these dopamine D2 receptors to a degree that we have a nice healthy cutoff point. So before dopamine becomes too harmful and desensitizes the whole system, basically. So again, the dopamine can work throughout the whole system in terms of in the brain, through the various regions. So some to mention are the hypothalamus, various regions in the brainstem, pituitary gland, the frontal lobes, in particular prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. And of course, like the eye and the retina as well. It's playing a big role there. It's also found in something called amacrine cells in the retina, and that's playing a big role in terms of what we spoke about before in regarding the eye health there. So we need dopamine to optimize the photoreceptors, and in particular melanopsin. And melanopsin's a blue light photoreceptor, and that absorbs 480 nanometer light. Now, we need that. And then this is the one that gets destroyed from artificial light and night, because we have this constant activation of this blue light. And that's going to cause something called melanopsin dysfunction. And that, not only that, but it degrades dopamine in itself, that blue light. So we create ourselves a pretty big problem. That's where circadian issues kick in. And that's where further issues downstream can kick in because of vitamin A in the form of retinol. The cycles of that get disrupted because it's tied to melanopsin. It's found next to it, and it naturally oxidizes, and it becomes reactive. But we have a mechanism in place to recycle it, and that involves melanin, that involves DHA, that involves optimal mitochondrial function and water. But when that becomes broken, that's when vitamin A, in the form of retinaldehyde, which is an aldehyde, which is reactive, will destroy all photoreceptors. And that doesn't just mean the ones that we know, like rods and cones and melanopsin and neuropsin, but also things such as B9, things such as B12, the aromatic amino acids, so tyrosine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and histidine, anything that's related to heme. So that will just inhibit mitochondrial function in general, oxygenation, and it will just influence the whole circadian mechanism negatively. So it's a big deal. And dopamine in itself helps increase the melanopsin mRNA, so it can be transcribed efficiently and we can make more. But again, if we are short-circuiting the system, it's going to be a huge problem. In terms of the ways we break down dopamine, actually, no, let's not get into that yet. So another thing that dopamine has, if you've heard of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that's literally blocking a serotonin transporter in the brain. And it also blocks the other ones like dopamine and noradrenaline, but to lesser extents. But we have something called the dopamine transporter, and it's called DAT for short. And that can be inhibited by nootropics. That can be inhibited by cocaine quite strongly. That's one of the main effects of cocaine. Is that it inhibits this transporter, as well as the norepinephrine one and serotonin to a degree. So what that basically does is that dopamine will, instead of going back into the neuron after it's binding to its receptor, it will just keep binding to the receptor and keep activating it and keep firing it. So again, in small amounts, it's okay. Like from a herbal or a supplement, it's fine. It's still up to, obviously you can't overdo it, but you can see how the problem with cocaine is the fact that it will do that at very strong amounts. And obviously, when we have a peak of high dopamine, it will drop back down to lower than baseline. And when it's lower than baseline, that's when we start to have a craving again. So that's where you have that craving to keep going, doing more and more and more and more. And that will just constantly desensitize the dopamine system. So you need more to block that dopamine transporter for it to act on the less receptors that are active now, because it keeps getting stimulated by it. And there's a desensitization effect. And this gets affected too. Like this is a big this gets destroyed, basically, this whole system, not just from cocaine, but just in terms of desensitization, is through anything that is artificial dopamine will just desensitize receptors. It will affect the activity of the release of dopamine, the synthesis. So, and also the fact that dopamine in itself, which is actually a good tie into what I want to talk about next, is that the way dopamine gets broken down is by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, MAO, and that can also be inhibited. So if you look at one of the protocols I did is how to craft your own nootropic stack. It talks about how you can inhibit these to your advantage. So you can inhibit MAO, but you can also inhibit the dopamine transporter DAT. Coffee actually does this. So coffee inhibits MAO, and when I talk about monoamines, that's classified as dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. So coffee in itself, but beyond the caffeine standpoint, will inhibit the breakdown of these neurotransmitters. And that's why I believe coffee is, you don't see everyone walking around drinking cups of tea and matcha. You see everyone hooked on coffee because it has a higher, more potent effect on the dopaminergic system as well as the monoamines in general. And when it breaks down, the dopamine breaks down various products, and they can be toxic. So it has to be metabolized properly. And this is the issue when we are having this artificial dopamine constantly pulse, is we're creating all these neurotoxins that create inflammation on steroids and destroy the whole dopaminergic system. So it has to be metabolized properly, and it goes through monoamine oxidase, and then it will form something called DOPAC. And that one is reactive in the body. So we need to get rid of it quickly. It's a neurotoxin. And then it goes through an enzyme called COMT, and that will form something called homovanillic acid. And that's the breakdown product of dopamine that gets excreted in the urine, and it will be found on an organic acids test. So you can see it high or low, depending on what's going on, or normal, of course. So the metabolism has to be correct. And this is the issue if you're not sleeping as well, because melatonin plays a role in the lymphatic system. And the brain's lymphatic system is called the glymphatic system, and melatonin plays a massive role in controlling that. So if circadian biology is off, or you're not sleeping, if you're partying or whatever it may be, then you're not clearing these neurotoxins properly, and there's just this accumulation, which is even more toxic to the body. So again, it's huge to take this all into account as to how disruptive the modern world is with all these dopamine pulses that are just artificial, and they're constantly just weakening the system, basically. There's a nootropic factor, and for those who don't know what that is, it's literally like a peptide that acts in the brain through various receptors to influence certain processes. It's kind of like a way to enhance brain architecture, neural architecture. And GDNF is called glial-derived nootropic factor. So it acts predominantly on glial cells, interesting enough, which is the somewhat other additional cell that's in high densities in the brain compared to a neuron. And it plays a massive role. in terms of what it does. I encourage you to read up on it because if we had, we can't have neurons without glial cells, basically. Another common name for them is astrocytes, and they influence this GDNF influences dopamine neurons, dopamine receptors, and activity in general, um, and enhances the whole dopaminergic system. So there's various herbs that you can take that will influence this. So this is a great thing to take if you are somewhat coming off like a low dopamine state and you're trying to dopamine detox. Taking something like GDNF is going to be a great crutch. And vitamin D makes it. So vitamin D from the sun will increase it. Um, Cinnamon is a big one. Cinnamon contains it. Even potatoes have it. And then in terms of herbals, ginkgo biloba, polygala, all increase it. Sodium butyrate, which is also made, butyrate's also made from a healthy gut microbiome. So yeah, pretty cool stuff in terms of what goes on there. With the dopaminergic system. So that's the pharmacology and biochemistry in a nutshell, basically, in terms of all that. So another way that we make dopamine as well is through a healthy gut microbiome. So um, dopamine in the gut is made through various gut microbes, and it will make around 50% of the dopamine that we take advantage of. This would be more tied to not the brain node, it'd be tied to the enteric nervous system and the peripheral system in general. But important to know that if your gut health is off, then you're probably going to be making less dopamine, and then again, it could be indirectly affecting the levels in the brain. Um, and as I said before, the modern world tanks our dopamine big time. And on top of that, melanin, melatonin, and vitamin D, and beyond that, a bunch of other things. But they're the main targets, because the lack of dopamine makes you fearful, makes you easily controlled, makes you a slave to big tech, big food, and big pharma. Lack of melanin, well, melanin does so much things in the body. It's not even funny. It's tied to bioenergetics, controlling inflammation and timing in cells, and dopamine as well. So that's a huge one. The melatonin, we just spoke about that. Required for sleep, required for lowering inflammation in the brain, required for mitochondrial function, and then vitamin D tied to the immune system. It's tied to sex hormones to a degree. It's tied to the gut. Um, and then it's also tied to dopamine, as we said, with the GDNF influence, and it also increases tyrosine hydroxylase, which is that first enzyme that converts tyrosine into L-DOPA. And look, there's more. There's plenty more in terms of what influences dopamine. It's just too much to talk about, honestly. I could talk about this for hours on end as to what influences dopamine and what doesn't. I'm going to name one more just because, and that's vitamin A in the form of retinoic acid. I can't remember which one it is because there's 9 cis, all trans, 11 cis, and 13 cis. I believe it's 9 cis, and this will increase dopamine receptors in the brain and dopamine release in general. So another big one there, and we have to remember that vitamin D in itself acts on the vitamin D receptor, but it requires the retinoid X receptor every single time for it to activate. So anytime you need vitamin D, you need vitamin A. And we know that vitamin A gets destroyed, as we spoke about before, through artificial light and non-native EMF, affecting the melanopsin biochemistry within us and liberating that vitamin A, that retinol into retinaldehyde, and it becomes extremely reactive and it doesn't get recycled properly, especially when we have low redox. And we spoke about dopamine and prolactin cycles in the brain. So just touching on that a bit more, prolactin influences, it shuts down the release of LH and FSH. And when you think about it, it makes sense. When you have sex and have an orgasm, uh, prolactin rises big time to suppress this mechanism and to suppress dopamine. You get that pulse of dopamine, obviously, for the reinforcement, but then that prolactin will dampen testosterone and sex hormones. And prolactin is actually needed high at night. So if you are taking a bunch of dopamine at night, or not dopamine, but anything to drive dopamine release, whether that's supplement wise or behavioral wise, then you're going to have issues with prolactin. And prolactin plays a big role in terms of enhancing our sleep beyond melatonin. So it's required at the right times. But dopamine acts as an inhibitory effect on prolactin, which is good in the right amounts, of course, because prolactin in itself can affect estrogen in the body as well, and serotonin, and can increase it to high amounts, higher than we need. And just touching on dopamine there, because I forgot to mention it, the reinforcing mechanism behind dopamine is just so crucial to understand, because we are setting the bar so high. So let me restart that. So dopamine acts in weird ways. Sometimes it gets released when we get a reward, but sometimes it will get released before. It depends on the habitual component of it. If it's something new, and you get you get a reward from it, that you'll get a high unexpected pulse of dopamine in a phasic firing response. And what happens there is it acts as that reinforcing mechanism, like especially if it's new. It's like, oh, this is good. I should keep doing this. I get rewarded for it. Hence why sunlight, sex, hunting and eating good food, all those kinds of things, learning something new will interact with this mechanism, so we get reinforced to keep doing it. Now, obviously, in the modern world, we get reinforced to doing bad things. Well, not bad things, but just artificial dopamine that will constantly degrade the dopamine system. And the only way we can actually somewhat feel something is to get this artificial dopamine response. It's like we go out in the sun, we feel nothing, can't get an erection, don't enjoy sex, has to be porn, has to be something fucked up that you have to watch, eating junk food and shit, because and that sometimes you'll have them stacked together because the dopamine is so low that you're just chasing this dragon basically. And this is exactly what happens in addiction of all kinds, and then you hit a breaking point and you just can't get any satisfaction anymore. And it's like you need to change. And when you have that time to change and you go through the detox from whatever it may be, it is extremely uncomfortable because your body is naturally wanting to chase that reinforcement, reward, pleasure pathway. And if you're not able to get it, you have these intense cravings because you need that stimulation to a degree. And this takes a good couple of months to regenerate, at least, depending on how severe it is. And yeah, it influences everything. This is why addictions are so full on, and it can really, really affect someone. So it's important to address the fact that I think if you are dealing with it yourself or working with someone who is dealing with this sort of low dopamine state through an addiction or wanting to change or whatever it may be, even just understanding the mechanisms that it's just this reinforcing neurotransmitter that rewires habits and whatever it may be. It's just huge to understand that the mechanisms behind why you might be feeling some discomfort, why you're feeling the cravings, and why it's important to just keep battling through, and look at the big picture, right? Now, I spoke about acetylcholine increasing it. And then serotonin has mixed effects depending on the receptor and depending on the region of the brain. You may hear people that say serotonin lowers dopamine and dopamine lowers serotonin. It is far more complicated than that. Dopamine in itself, there's studies found that dopamine can actually act on serotonin receptors. It can act on noradrenaline, adrenergic receptors. So that's noradrenaline and adrenaline, and melatonin receptors, as well as some of the transporters. So there's just a lot of nuance to this, in terms of it's not just 1 + 1 = 2 per se when it comes to understanding pharmacology and neurochemistry in general. Because again, there's 5 different receptors in the dopamine, in the dopaminergic pathways. There's 16 different receptors in serotonin. So it's not that simple. There's a lot of nuance as to what is going on. Sometimes they can synergize together. Sometimes they will deplete each other. And also, when it comes to dopamine, the way it fires, as I said, there's that phasic firing, which is slightly more intense and heightened, whereas there's tonic firing, which is a bit more behind the scenes, not as intense per se. And that phasic firing is where we feel that reward and reinforcement and motivation. That's where you feel it. You know what's going on. You feel the intensity of it per se. And it can feel good. It feels great. You feel on top of the world. But something important to note here is that the firing of the dopamine can also alter the affinity of the receptors. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So there is two forms of dopamine. Well, there's only one form of dopamine, but in terms of the behavioral components, there's the pleasure-based system and fear-based system. And this is the same for noradrenaline. The way it fires and the way the neural circuitry behind the scenes. So maybe cortisol and ACTH and CRF and dynorphin are playing a big role there in terms of altering firing of the dopamine depending on the region of the brain. But the fear-based dopamine will get released initially under stress. And this is good short term, obviously, because it helps us deal with stress. And noradrenaline's playing a role there too in terms of this release. And that's going to degrade that melanin a little bit. And look, it's there to be used. Now, obviously, the problem with the modern world is that we are chronically in this state of fear, state of fight or flight, or sympathetic tone, if you will. And this dopamine is constantly firing until it's burnt out, and we have none left in the tank, basically. And that's because the firing rates of this dopamine in this state is just significantly higher. And that autoreceptor we spoke about before, the D2 receptor, doesn't, the feedback loop gets affected there. And again, it's tying to different neurohormones and neurotransmitters involved in this process that are also going to amplify the fear response. So this is wired in a way and fired in a way that creates this feeling of discomfort. Glutamate's a big one too that's involved here, and low GABA. And this feeling of discomfort is huge. And then what actually goes on is that eventually it gets to a point where we start releasing something called dynorphin. And dynorphin is an opioid, much like endorphins, but it binds to a different receptor. So the endorphins, beta endorphin binds to the MU opioid receptor, or MOR for short. And that actually increases dopamine indirectly by disinhibiting GABA neurons. Now, the dynorphin acts on a kappa opioid receptor, which is KOR for short, and this will directly inhibit dopamine big time because it's getting too high. And when we're in this state of fear, state of even social isolation, this dynorphin is chronically rising and increase to shut down dopamine production. And this is where these bad habits can kick into gear as well in terms of drug use or alcohol or porn or whatever it may be. Again, I've mentioned them a bunch of times. I'm just going to categorize it as artificial dopamine. And you need more because you have this dynorphin sitting behind, shutting down the dopamine like so quickly before you can even increase it. And again, it's also just being degraded in general through these mechanisms because it's firing so rapidly. And it's not the pleasurable effect that we have because it's the neurochemistry behind it and what else is involved. You got to think of the brain as like all these little circuits, and we need all these circuits for reward and pleasure and euphoria and attention-based pathways. They have to be wired nicely, each little circuit. So if we have like one circuit on for the dopamine and you think that's good, but then we have all these stress-related circuits on, it's not going to be good whatsoever. Now, dopamine can also form noradrenaline and adrenaline downstream. So dopamine via an enzyme called DOPA decarboxylase dopamine beta hydroxylase will convert dopamine into noradrenaline. And that requires copper and vitamin C. And then that noradrenaline can form adrenaline downstream too, which requires a methylation enzyme. So a methyl group gets added to it. It's called PNMT is the enzyme. Now, So again, this dopamine, even if you are trying to increase this dopamine, but you're in this sympathetic state, who's to say that it's the dopamine is just downstream, just getting formed into these stress hormones even more so and innervating the sympathetic nervous system? There's every chance that could be happening. And you're not actually getting that dopamine pulse that you want. A few other things that influence dopamine. So DHEA and DHA actually, but DHEA is a hormone made from pregnenolone that is in high concentrations. Downstream, it forms testosterone and DHT and estrogen, but it also acts as an anti-inflammatory hormone to counteract cortisol and interleukin 6 and TNF alpha, which are the cytokines that are tied to cortisol and some forms of autoimmunity. Now, this DHEA also acts as a neurohormone. So when I say neurohormone, it's literally like a neurotransmitter or hormone that acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And testosterone actually does this as well, and so does estrogen, which is pretty cool. And DHEA can act as an agonist for various receptors and an antagonist for others. So it'll act as an agonist for the NMDA receptor, which increases glutamate, which is good in the right amounts. But it can also increase dopamine, the D1 receptor, and also something called the sigma 1 receptor, which influences dopamine downstream and inhibits that DHA transporter that we spoke about. And this DHEA is made ideally from optimal sunlight, circadian biology being and light dark cycles being optimized, of course, and also having that cortisol at a lower level, so we have our stores of DHEA not being used up to counteract cortisol. Estrogen and testosterone can also increase dopamine through tyrosine hydroxylase. And then testosterone in itself can potentially raise GDNF. This is DHT too. This is that positive feedback loop that we love as men, and it's the one that's getting attacked and dysregulated in the modern world. Tying back with DHA, so DHA is found in seafood, and that influences dopamine receptors as well. It literally forms a shell around the dopamine receptors to help enhance its activity. But then also in itself can act as a positive allosteric modulator. So it just increases the binding capacity of dopamine, especially on the D2 receptors. And you've got to think that seafood, well, DHA, look, it's found at the equator and in the tropics, but nowhere near as much as the higher latitudes. So you got to think that DHA is just giving you more bang for your buck when it comes to dopamine as well, beyond just influencing our whole biology. So yeah, pretty important. And we got to remember as well, in the cold and the winter months, there's obviously less UV light, there's less melanin, there's less dopamine synthesis and production. But where for example, me in the tropics, I'm making more melanin, but I require less DHA in terms of the dopamine related pathways because there's more UV light as well. So I need less bang for my buck in that regard. And then sunlight in itself increases, it doesn't only interact with tyrosine, but through various signals, probably through water networks and things of that nature as well, downstream, it sends information to our brain to increase dopamine receptor density in various regions, especially the striatum. And that's good as well. We want that. So that in itself acts as like a resensitization mechanism. So for anyone who is low dopamine, sunlight is your antidote, basically. And then we spoke about this before, but low dopamine is a state that the modern world, a lot of people are in. And what happens there is that you are unable to extinguish any fear. So you become fearful. And when you become fearful, you become more controlled. When you become more controlled, you become a slave to everything we spoke about before. And then this also ties to poor judgment and decision-making issues, like unable to make a decision for yourself, basically. So then you get told what to do by the higher up. And we see that, like we literally see that to a T in a lot of Western countries. It also makes you lack awareness. So if you're lacking awareness, again, it's just tying in with everything that I literally just said. lacking awareness means you are literally just not aware of what is going on, what is happening in the world. Which again, obviously there is some crazy shit happening in the world right now. And the less dopamine you have, the less you realize that basically. And as I said, dopamine is the antidote to overcoming fear. So not having dopamine, again, making it extremely controllable. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's almost an hour of talking about dopamine. And I'll just touch on melanin quickly as well. So melanin, as we said, it indirectly increases L-DOPA, and that can be released from melanocytes in general. So if you have something like a BH4 deficiency, getting to the tropics and getting lots of sunlight and making L-DOPA that way is going to be huge, because you literally cannot make it to make dopamine downstream. But this melanin can continue to be built and migrated throughout the system. It can be found throughout the whole neuroectoderm, where melanocytes and POMC neurons are found in decent concentrations throughout. And what that can do is that melanin can break down into catecholamines, such as dopamine, because its a structure is very similar. Basically, melanin, when it's formed in these sheets, is literally got the structure of dopamine in it. In like a polymer form. And what a polymer form is, just literally consistent melanin molecules all connected together, and then they again form this sheet, basically, and that acts as like a solar panel. But then that when the light is missing and we become hypoxic, that's when melanin can degrade, and that degrades into dopamine. It can degrade into noradrenaline and adrenaline, and this is good in the right amounts, and this can be used to our advantage because it's acting as like a reservoir. And you might have heard Jack Cruz speak about this, but he was saying that creativity, which is tied to dopamine, wasn't something that was common before we started to use fire. So before we were using fire, we were just in pitch darkness, and there was no hypoxia per se. But as soon as there was some sort of light, we were staying up that little bit longer, and then hypoxia kicks in because we're not just because of the light, basically. And again, it's not sharp blue light, but it's still light that can influence degradation of melanin, and then that melanin breaks down into dopamine. And if we look at what's going on in caves, that's when art started to appear. Is when we relocated to caves at night, and we started to use fire because that was a form of light. Um, so very interesting connection there. And if you think about this in the modern world as to what is going on, I mean, if you just think about artists like singers and people from bands or whatever it may be, if you look at them, they all are very creative, but they all have serious dopamine issues. They have drug issues. Prime example is someone like Michael Jackson or someone like Eminem, who they're extremely creative, extremely talented, but then they literally have no dopamine. And this is partially why like people like Kurt Cobain committed suicide. It's because he was under artificial light and blue light, artificial light and non-native EMF constantly, right? Um, And again, it's also tied to just that emptiness you feel after literally being able to have all this money in the world and playing to these massive crowds. And the only thing that can make you feel something is something like heroin. And heroin downstream does influence dopamine. It is an opioid, but again, endorphins influence dopamine big time. It's just more of an inhibitory effect downstream because it's acting very strongly at the opioid receptors. Um, so yeah, it's pretty interesting. And then you think in the modern world where people are constantly inside and they're constantly TikToking late at night, or whatever it may be, and I should say artificial dopamine because I said I was going to say that. Constantly using artificial dopamine at night. So they're just driving this melanin degradation. And we know that melanin's important for various other mechanisms throughout the body. And we've just lost that. Completely. And we lose the dopamine too because we need to make more to feel something. Um, so yeah, it can get pretty deep. I might do another part on this and like go a little bit deeper after maybe a Q&A or something. If you guys have any questions, but it is just incredible. I think dopamine is one of the most amazing and interesting molecules in the human body, and the whole pathway in general regarding tyrosine and melanin, because it's just so fundamental to get right in the modern world to thrive and succeed. Because high dopamine feels amazing. I mean, you are just fueled with purpose and curiosity and awareness that you couldn't imagine you'd ever have. And it just gives you the energy to invest into anything that you want. It's generally, well, it's always something positive because once you're at that high dopamine state, you're not chasing any of those other artificial dopamines because you just don't even have the craving or thought for them. Um, so yeah, it's very complicated in terms of everything I spoke about. But again, it just comes back to these basic mechanisms in terms of the reinforcement of dopamine, and the pleasure related pathways. And then obviously there's other stuff tied to it with the fear and the habits and things of that nature. But very important neurotransmitter, very important hormone, is dopamine. And I hope this helped shed some light on dopamine, in the body. Um, But yeah, thank you. If you've listened this far, good job. You may require a few re-listens, which I encourage, and have a great rest of your day. We'll be in touch.